The Supreme Court chamber fell silent as Justice Amy Coney Barrett leaned forward, her piercing gaze fixed on Representative Jasmine Crockett. The normally composed justice's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Congresswoman Crockett, you've repeatedly claimed this case is about protecting democracy, but your own statements contradict the very Constitution you swore to defend," Barrett said, her tone sharp and accusatory. "How do you justify such blatant hypocrisy to this court and to the American people?" The chamber gasped. Veteran court reporters froze, pens hovering above notepads. This was unprecedented. A Supreme Court justice directly challenging a sitting congresswoman during oral arguments. The atmosphere crackled with tension as cameras captured Barrett's stern expression and Crockett's momentary shock. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of retreating, Representative Crockett slowly stood, straightened her blazer, and approached the microphone. What she pulled from her folder next left Barrett visibly stunned and would change the course of one of the most significant constitutional cases in decades. No one could have predicted that in the next 15 minutes, Crockett would not only defend herself but completely turn the tables on Barrett with evidence that would leave the entire Supreme Court bench speechless. Justice Amy Coney Barrett sat tall at the Supreme Court bench. Her black robe was pristine, her expression stern yet composed. At 53, Barrett had become a conservative, legal icon since her controversial confirmation in 2020. The former Notre Dame law professor and mother of 7 had been President Trump's third Supreme Court appointment, cementing the court's 6-3 conservative majority. Legal analysts regularly praised her sharp intellect and strict textualist approach to the Constitution. The case before the court involved a challenge to a new voting rights bill that Representative Jasmine Crockett had championed through Congress. The legislation aimed to expand ballot access and increase federal oversight of state election procedures. Policies conservatives viewed as federal overreach and progressives considered essential protections. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If Barrett and the conservative majority struck down the law, Republican-led states would retain greater control over their election procedures. If the law survived, federal standards would reshape voting access across America ahead of the upcoming presidential election. For months, conservative media had painted Crockett as a radical, pushing an unconstitutional agenda. Headlines accused her of trying to federalize elections through the back door. Fox News commentators questioned whether Crockett, a former civil rights attorney, was deliberately undermining state sovereignty. Yet Crockett, 43, had risen quickly through political ranks after winning her Texas congressional seat in 2022. A former public defender and state representative, she had earned national attention for her outspoken advocacy and razor-sharp legal arguments. With degrees from both Rhodes College and the University of Houston Law Center, Crockett had built a reputation as someone who came thoroughly prepared and wasn't afraid to confront opposition directly. "I don't back down from bullies, whether they are in state legislatures or on the highest court in the land," she had told reporters the previous week. "This bill simply ensures every eligible American can exercise their constitutional right to vote without unnecessary barriers. Anyone opposing that should explain why they fear American citizens voting." These comments had apparently struck a nerve with Justice Barrett, who had been unusually vocal during earlier procedural hearings, suggesting the legislation represented federal overreach into state affairs, a constitutional line she believed shouldn't be crossed. As the Supreme Court session began that morning, the chamber was filled to capacity. Legal experts from both sides of the aisle packed the gallery. CNN and Fox News had reporters positioned outside, ready to broadcast reactions the moment the hearing concluded. Scholars predicted a tense but standard proceeding following Supreme Court protocol. No one anticipated the dramatic confrontation about to unfold. The Solicitor General had just completed her opening defense of the voting rights bill, when Justice Barrett unexpectedly focused her attention directly on Representative Crockett, seated in the front row of the gallery. "Before we continue, I'd like to address Representative Crockett directly," Barrett said, breaking normal court protocol. Chief Justice Roberts looked surprised but didn't interrupt. Barrett pressed on. "Congresswoman, you've championed legislation that fundamentally alters the balance of power established in our Constitution. You've publicly stated, 'This court has no business reviewing congressional legislation on voting rights.' Your exact words on CNN last month were, The Supreme Court needs to stay in its lane. The chamber tensed as Barrett's criticism intensified. Such statements reflect a troubling disregard for constitutional separation of powers, the very foundation of our republic, she continued. Court observers exchanged shocked glances. This direct confrontation was almost unheard of in Supreme Court proceedings. The Chief Justice shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent as Barrett continued her pointed critique. Representative Crockett, you've built your career claiming to defend constitutional principles, yet your legislation appears designed to circumvent the Constitution's clear delegation of election authority to states. This contradiction demands explanation. It was a political and legal ambush broadcast live to millions of Americans. Conservative commentators in the room could barely contain their satisfaction as Barrett methodically laid out her case against both Crockett and the voting rights legislation. What no one realized was that Representative Crockett had anticipated this moment and had come prepared with evidence that would stun the court and the nation. The Supreme Court chamber remained frozen in anticipation of her next move. Representative Crockett rose from her seat with deliberate calm, carrying a thin folder of documents. As she approached the podium, the air in the chamber grew heavier. She placed the folder on the lectern, opened it slowly, and looked directly at Justice Barrett. Justice Barrett, Crockett began, her voice firm but steady. You've accused me of undermining the Constitution, but what I hold here demonstrates that this legislation is not only constitutional, it is rooted in the very principles this court has upheld for over half a century. She lifted a set of papers high, enough for the justices to see. Reporters craned their necks. Cameras zoomed in. The document Crockett held was not a fiery speech but a collection of legal precedents, Supreme Court rulings stretching back decades. She began reading aloud passages from decisions authored by justices both liberal and conservative, each affirming Congress's authority to protect voting rights when states imposed barriers that disenfranchised citizens. One by one, she laid them out. South Carolina vs. Katzenbach, Oregon vs. Mitchell, Shelby County vs. Holder. Each case, Crockett argued, confirmed that Congress had the constitutional power to enforce the 15th Amendment and safeguard the right to vote. She spoke with the precision of a seasoned attorney, weaving history, precedent, and constitutional text into a defense so airtight that murmurs rippled through the gallery. Then came the moment that stunned the court. Crockett produced a memo, recently obtained through congressional inquiry, showing internal communications from several state officials. In blunt language, the officials admitted that proposed state-level restrictions were designed not for election integrity but to limit turnout in urban precincts and reduce access in minority-heavy districts. The room erupted in whispers. Barrett's expression tightened as she realized the weight of the evidence before her. Chief Justice Roberts leaned forward, peering at the document with visible concern. Even some of the conservative justices, usually unmoved by political theatrics, exchanged uneasy glances. This isn't theory, Crockett declared, her voice rising with conviction. It's proof. Proof that without federal oversight, states are already preparing to weaponize their power against American citizens exercising their most fundamental right, the right to vote. She paused, scanning the faces of the justices. The Constitution was not written to protect state governments from accountability. It was written to protect the people from abuse of power. For the first time, the confidence seemed to drain from Barrett's demeanor. Her sharp posture softened ever so slightly, and the silence that followed carried more weight than any rebuttal. The gallery sat frozen, every ear tuned to the sound of Crockett closing her folder with deliberate finality. What began as an ambush had turned into a reversal so complete that legal analysts in attendance whispered it could alter the trajectory of the case, and perhaps even the future of voting rights in America. The chamber remained suspended in silence after Representative Jasmine Crockett closed her folder. The force of her words and the weight of the documents she had presented hung in the air like a storm cloud. Even the rustle of papers from the clerks had stopped. Every set of eyes, from the justices on the bench to the rows of spectators in the gallery, remained fixed on the Congresswoman. It was the kind of silence that came not from disinterest but from awe. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who had launched the confrontation, sat motionless. Her chin rested on her hand, her brow furrowed in a rare expression of hesitation. Barrett was known for her composure, for maintaining an image of unshakable authority. Yet in that moment her silence spoke volumes. It was not the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of someone recalculating. Chief Justice John Roberts cleared his throat. It was a subtle sound, but in the echoing chamber it rang with authority. He leaned forward, his hands folded tightly. "Representative Crockett," he said, his tone measured, "the court thanks you for your contribution. While it is unusual for a member of Congress to address the bench directly, given the circumstances, your materials will be entered into the record." His eyes flicked briefly toward Barrett, as if signaling both acknowledgement and caution. The ripple of whispers in the gallery swelled again. Court reporters scribbled furiously, knowing they were witnessing something historic, a congresswoman effectively challenging a Supreme Court justice on live television, and not only holding her ground but commanding the moment. Crockett, unfazed, gave a small nod. "Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. My only goal is to ensure this court fully understands that this legislation is not an act of defiance against the Constitution, but an act of fidelity to it. Our democracy cannot thrive when the right to vote is treated as optional or conditional. It must be guaranteed." With that, she stepped back from the lectern, returning to her seat. The sound of her heels on the marble floor punctuated the gravity of her statement. The audience exhaled as though they had collectively been holding their breath. Justice Sonia Sotomayor leaned toward her microphone. Her voice, though calm, carried a resonance that cut through the tension. "This court has long recognized that the right to vote is preservative of all other rights. Without it, every other liberty is diminished." Her gaze shifted down the bench toward Barrett, as if to remind her colleague that history was watching. Barrett adjusted her robe slightly but said nothing. The Solicitor General, who had been standing quietly at counsel's table, seized the moment. "If I may, Your Honors," she said, "Representative Crockett's materials only reinforce the argument we've been making, that Congress has both the authority and the duty to legislate in this area when states threaten to undermine equal access to the ballot. The evidence she presented today goes to the heart of this case, whether the Constitution allows Congress to act as a safeguard for democracy itself." Justice Clarence Thomas, who rarely spoke during arguments, leaned forward slightly. His expression was hard to read, but his brief glance at the evidence suggested concern. Justice Brett Kavanaugh scribbled notes on his legal pad, his lips pressed into a thin line. The weight of Crockett's intervention was undeniable. The hearing continued for another hour, but the dynamic had shifted completely. Barrett, once sharp and confrontational, asked no further questions of Crockett. Instead, she pressed the Solicitor General on narrower issues of federalism, careful not to wade into the same rhetorical quicksand that had left her momentarily disarmed. Roberts, ever the guardian of the court's institutional image, steered the discussion back to legal technicalities. Still, the sense lingered that something profound had occurred, something no justice could simply brush aside. When the session concluded, the justices retreated to their private conference, and Crockett walked out of the chamber flanked by cameras, reporters, and stunned colleagues. Microphones were thrust toward her, and she spoke with the same clarity she had shown inside. "Today wasn't about me," she said firmly. "It was about every American who has ever stood in line for hours, been turned away by arbitrary rules, or had their voice silenced by those who feared democracy. The right to vote is sacred, and I will not apologize for defending it." The footage aired within minutes across every major news network. Clips of Barrett's pointed challenge juxtaposed against Crockett's calm, devastating rebuttal replayed on loop. CNN's Kyron blared, "Crockett stuns Supreme Court with evidence in voting rights showdown." Fox News, initially celebratory of Barrett's questioning, was forced to recalibrate its narrative. Commentators argued heatedly over whether Crockett's display had been a breach of decorum or an act of courage. By evening, social media had exploded. Hashtags like Crockett vs. Barrett and Protect the Vote trended worldwide. Millions watched the clip of Crockett holding up the memo exposing state-level voter suppression strategies. For many, it confirmed suspicions long whispered in political circles but rarely laid bare in such stark terms. Legal scholars began weighing in, calling the confrontation one of the most dramatic in modern Supreme Court history. Lawrence Tribe, the Harvard constitutional scholar, tweeted, "What Crockett did today was not just political theater. It was constitutional advocacy of the highest order. The justices will not be able to ignore the record she created." Meanwhile, Barrett's critics pounced on her silence after Crockett's presentation. Progressive commentators argued that the justice had been unprepared to defend her accusations once confronted with precedent and evidence. Conservative voices attempted to spin the exchange as disrespectful to the court, but even some admitted privately that Barrett had been caught off guard. Inside the Supreme Court, the justices faced an uncomfortable reality. Their decision would not be made in a vacuum. It would be made under the weight of a national spotlight. For Barrett, the confrontation risked defining her legacy, not as a principled textualist, but as a justice bested in open court by a sitting congresswoman. Roberts, ever concerned with the court's reputation, worried about how a ruling against the law might be perceived after such a dramatic public moment. Over the following weeks, amicus briefs poured in from civil rights groups, state attorneys general, and constitutional scholars, many citing Crockett's evidence as proof that federal protections were urgently needed. The case, already momentous, had been transformed into a defining battle for the future of American democracy. When the decision finally came months later, it carried the weight of that unforgettable day in the chamber. By a narrow 5-4 margin, the Supreme Court upheld Crockett's voting rights legislation. Roberts joined the liberal justices, citing both constitutional precedent and the compelling evidence of discriminatory intent revealed during oral arguments. Barrett, in dissent, wrote a blistering opinion warning of federal overreach, but her words were overshadowed by the narrative that had taken hold, that Jasmine Crockett had stood up to the highest court in the land and won. The political fallout was immediate. Crockett's profile skyrocketed. She became a fixture on national talk shows, a household name in progressive circles, and a feared adversary in conservative ones. Fundraising for her party surged, with donors citing her bravery and eloquence as inspiration. Activists dubbed her the defender of democracy, and her speeches drew massive crowds. For Barrett, the episode left a lingering mark. Though still revered in conservative legal circles, she became synonymous with the dramatic clash, her sharp words replayed endlessly alongside Crockett's stunning rebuttal. Critics questioned whether she had miscalculated in breaking protocol to confront the congresswoman so directly. Supporters defended her as principled, but even they conceded that the optics of the moment had been disastrous. In the broader sense, the showdown reshaped the national conversation on voting rights. What had begun as a legal battle in the marble chamber of the Supreme Court spilled into the streets, energizing a new wave of activism. Voter registration drives surged. State legislatures, suddenly under heightened scrutiny, faced lawsuits challenging restrictive election laws. And across the nation, ordinary Americans spoke of feeling, for the first time in years, that the fight for democracy had a champion willing to stand toe-to-toe with even the most powerful figures in government. Looking back, historians would mark that day not merely as a turning point in one case, but as a pivotal moment in American democracy. In a chamber built to symbolize authority and permanence, a lone congresswoman had reminded the nation that the Constitution was not a weapon for the powerful, but a shield for the people. And as Jasmine Crockett walked out of the Supreme Court, shoulders squared and head held high, she had done more than defend a bill. She had altered the trajectory of history,